to know how to live the way God intended? Then this podcast series is tailor-made for you. David Taverner asks Bible expert Mike Beaumont why Jesus spoke about living God's way using parables. And Mike will sum up what this means for us today in just 3 words.
We're looking this time, Mike, at Jesus' parable of the narrow and wide gates. Again, part of his sort of big sermon. I always thought sort of sermons had to have 3 points.
Yeah, I think Jesus has had 33 here. But he probably did take quite a while over it rather than trying to squash it into half an hour. So I think he was able to do it. Yeah, it's stretched out in Matthew, hasn't it? The what we now call the Sermon on the Mount spreads out over 3 chapters of Matthew's Gospel. And, I imagine Jesus teaching this through the day, making sure people had understood it. And as we followed it through over these last few episodes, as he starts out his ministry there in Capernaum, having left his hometown of Nazareth, rejected by his own people, relocated to that fishing town of Capernaum that would become his base really for the next 2 to 3 years. And he takes his disciples one day to a hillside and a flat area just below that hillside to the west of Capernaum that you and I visited and that we've spoken from in a different episode, looking at Jesus then and now in 30 minutes. And there he's taught them what life is like in God's kingdom. That's really what this whole sermon is about. If you become my follower, this is what life will look like. He starts with those well-known beatitudes that turn earthly values upside down when we put Jesus at the center. He's called them to be salt and light. He's called them to live in a completely different attitude to God's law than the nitpicking, punctilious, self-righteous way the scribes and Pharisees fulfilled it, but to have a heart attitude to fulfilling God's law. He then went in chapter 6 to looking at some really practical expressions of devotional life, things like giving to the poor and needy, praying to God, fasting, a whole section on taking care where we invest our treasures in life. Will it be on earth or in heaven? And reminding us that we've got a good heavenly Father who, if he feeds birds and plants, will certainly take care of us. And then in chapter 7, he moved on to the issue of, not judging others, but equally learning how to be discriminating at times. We had that great passage that we looked at in a previous episode where he reminded us that prayer to his Father is a relational thing of asking and seeking and knocking and trusting that he is a good God who gives us only the best. And it's like he's built up such a wonderful picture of what life is like in God's kingdom. And now at this point, as he draws towards the end of his sermon, he's getting to his conclusion, we would say, he brings home there's a decision to be made. Because really a lot of his teaching up to this point has been, it's been encouraging. It's also been challenging because it's a challenge to live life differently. It's a challenge to be his disciple and to live life God's way, as we've called this whole series. And to do that, it starts when we make choices. And so as he comes into land, as it were, towards the end of this sermon, he calls on his listeners, disciples around him, wider crowd listening in too, that if this is what you want, then there are choices that need to be made, because it's impossible to follow Jesus without making choices. And he says, I want you to know, sometimes these choices will be costly.
Well, this is the picture he uses to illustrate his sermon. It's in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 7 and verse 13, where Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." I think if Jesus was a salesman, I'm not quite sure if I'd buy what he was selling.
Yeah, he's telling it as it is here, isn't he? But once again, doing so through using something very ordinary. We said right early on at the beginning of this series that one of the most common features of Jesus's parables is that he takes things from ordinary, everyday life. And this picture of choosing a way to walk couldn't be more ordinary. Remember, in those days, the vast majority of people walked everywhere. Jesus himself walked everywhere. We only have one example of him riding on Palm Sunday on that donkey into Jerusalem. And the Apostle Paul would certainly have walked wherever he went for the vast majority of his journeys. And people who walked would know that they were often easy paths and tricky, narrow paths. Sometimes the tricky, narrow ones might be shortcuts, over the top of a hill or through a ravine. And you and I have been to the Holy Land for previous series, and we've seen how dangerous and tricky some of those narrow paths are that cling to the edge of hillsides with sheer drops down below. Now, at a human level, if you were walking somewhere and you got the option of either taking a broad, straight path or taking the tricky, narrow path that was full of potential treachery and pitfalls, which would you choose? It's obvious. You choose the broad one. But Jesus uses that picture and flips it on its head and says, but choosing the broad one in terms of following me is the most dangerous choice of all you could make.
I was just thinking that you and I have been out and about over the years walking, perhaps in an area we don't know, and we don't know where a particular route goes. And that is life, isn't it? You don't always know where a particular choice is going to take you.
Yeah, absolutely. Though we spend much of our lives trying to, ascertain where it will go. We make choices to do certain subjects at school because that will do this and it will open the door to that university or that apprenticeship, and then we'll do this and then we'll do that. And we like to have a plan, and I suppose in some ways it's partly human to make plans. But one of the things about following Jesus is he has a way of, how can I put it, messing up our plans. They're never messed up ultimately. They're always for good. And the key thing about walking with Jesus is a readiness to follow him wherever he takes us and not to take the obvious, easy choice. Now, that does not mean if there's an easy choice and a hard choice, it's more spiritual to take the hard choice just because it's hard. I had a friend many years ago when I was at Bible college who seemed to take a perverse delight, who, if there were two ways to do it, he would always choose the harder way on principle. And I always thought, you know what? I'm going to take the easier way on this one because it really, really doesn't matter. But there are times in life when it does matter. And that's why Jesus is saying here, look, if you're going to make a decision about following me, which is what this whole section is about, you're going to have to choose the narrow gate and the narrow path. That wide gate and that wide path, oh, they look so inviting. They look so easy, but they lead the wrong way. And my way often has a small, narrow gate that means stuff has to be left behind, and it might look tricky on the way, but it's always the best ultimately.
Yes, again, Jesus seems to be using contrasting examples to make the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Very Jewish thing to do, particularly the two ways. You find it in the Psalms, for example, Psalm 1, as the way of the blessed and the way of the man who doesn't walk in God's ways. So very, very typical Jewish way. People would have connected with it. And so these contrasts of two ways, two gates, two destinies, two crowds in all of them. The two ways, the easy way, it's broad, it's spacious. I suppose, how would we sum that up today? It's the way that says there's plenty of room on it for a diversity of opinions and attitudes and actions. It's the sort of live and let live way. It's the way of no curbs, no boundaries, no restrictions. It's the way of, hey, if that works for you, that's fine, but just don't comment on my way, please. I can't believe a better description of our culture today, a broad way where anything goes. But Jesus says, that's not my way. My way is the hard way. It's the narrow way. What does a narrow way have? Well, it has clearly defined boundaries. It has restrictions. It has dangers if you step over the edge of it. And Jesus is saying here, if you're going to be a follower of mine, you can't sort of live a half and half life. You can't live a half in, half out. You can't have your left foot on the broad road and your right foot on the narrow road. You know, there's no middle way. There's no halfway. There's no merging of the different ways. You have to make a choice. The point comes where you have to make a decision. Am I going to walk the world's way? It's easy, it's broad, anything goes. Or am I going to walk Jesus's way that is narrow and that will feel constraining and constricting at times, but is the way that leads to life?
People say all paths lead to God.
Yeah, they do. But the thing I always remember is Jesus didn't say that. In fact, he said the very opposite. He said in John's Gospel, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Now, if I am going to be an authentic Christian, I cannot reject that. I have to line up with what Jesus says about that. And Jesus is very clear there that all religions and all paths do not lead to God. I've often heard it said, well, all religions are the same, aren't they? And I take great delight in saying, well, what do you mean by that? They've all got different views of God, including one that God does not exist. It's just nirvana, nothingness. They all have different ways of getting there. They all have different saviors. How can they be all the same? They are not all the same. They have different messages, different goals. And I have to stand by what Jesus said. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me, in John chapter 14. So, if you're going to be an authentic Christian, you have to line up with that. You've got to face up to that, and you have to let go of, doesn't everyone get there at the end? Well, that's not what Jesus said. He says there is only this one way. That's why it's narrow. You see, the broad way is anything goes. Come on, we live in a pluralistic, multicultural society, which we do. We should honour and respect everyone, which we should. Absolutely. Treat everyone as equal fellow citizens. But that does not mean I have to agree with everything that they believe, and certainly not when it comes to God. And, there's no one more loving than Jesus. Jesus loved us enough to come into this world to die on the cross for our sins. That's the ultimate expression of love. But this same Jesus was also very clear. You're in or you're out. You make a decision to keep walking your own broad way, but I want to tell you, it leads to destruction. One of the words that he uses elsewhere for hell. It leads to a life of ultimate separation from God and everything that's good and beautiful. Or you follow me. And do you know what? At times that will be hard. It will be narrow. The gate will feel wide. What's the thing about a narrow gate? Well, sometimes you have to leave stuff behind, don't you? You have to take your rucksack off to get through it. There'll be baggage you can't bring with you. Jesus is saying here. So Jesus himself is the one who says that he's the only way, and his way's a narrow way. It's hard to get in because there's stuff to be left behind. There'll be stuff to be abandoned on the way. Hey, but you know what? Once you get on that narrow way, it is the most exciting, fulfilling, adventurous life you could ever have, and you will discover on it the best that you could ever possibly be with Jesus.
When Jesus says, "For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction," how does he know?
Well, because he's God, and God knows everything. And he's seen how things have been from the beginning. If Jesus is what Christians believe, the incarnation, the appearance in human physical form of the eternal God who's been there from the beginning, then he's seen it all. And he's looked back through life and he's seen where selfish, human-centered, human choices lead. It always leads to destruction. It leads to human destruction. And way back at the beginning, God had put a choice, there's that word again, a choice to Adam and Eve in the garden. It was a really simple one, wasn't it? It was, here's a beautiful world that I've made for you. You can have absolutely everything. It's all yours to rule and look after on my behalf. Oh, it's just one thing. You see that tree over there? Don't wait to eat from that one. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in the day that you eat of that, you'll die. And of course, what's the one thing that they want? What's the one thing that Satan tempts them to have? What's the one wrong choice they make? Yeah, it's to take that one. And what happens at that very moment? They didn't die physically, but something died in them. It says, at that moment, their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. And suddenly they feel embarrassed. Something's gone wrong internally with them through this dislocation with God, this disobedience to God. And from that moment on, what the Bible calls sin starts to spread and affect every aspect of human nature and every human being who's ever lived. And where did it lead for Adam and Eve? It led to them being expelled from the garden, cherubim being put at the gate so they could never come back in. A picture of, this is what sin leads to, separation from God. And not just separation in this life, but ultimate separation in the life to come. Because we've made a choice. We've made a choice that says, I don't want to live with you, God. I don't want to live life your way. So God says, okay, but I want you to know, if you stay with this choice, this is your choice forever. This is your choice for eternity. So how does Jesus know? Because he's God and he's been there from the beginning. He set the parameters. He's seen it outworked. He's seen it worked out through the course of human history. And yet he himself will go to the cross to pay the price of sin so that can be broken and we can escape from that downward spiral of sin and come into the new life that he has for us. We can be transferred from that easy living, broad road with the broad gate of anything goes that goes off a cliff edge at the end and join him on his road of adventure in life, a life that will never end.
I'm thinking of a parent with a teenager who wants to go down a particular road in their life.
Yeah.
And the parent sort of knows that that's not the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah, challenging, isn't it? And particularly as our kids grow up. But I'm always reminded of another parable that we'll look at in a future episode, which is the parable of the prodigal son, where the father loves the son enough to let him go. And gives him a share of the estate, and the son goes and makes a mess of life. But what the father never let go of was his son in his heart and his son in prayer. And so when the son finally comes to his senses and comes back, there's the dad waiting, looking for him. The minute he sees him on the horizon, running out towards him. So, when our kids are little, when my 3 daughters were little, they used to have to do what Mum and I told them, and if you got the pushback of why, well, you gave them the answer because I say so, don't you, at that age? And then as they grow up, you try to explain a little more so they get understanding of why. And then you get to those sort of tricky teenage years where you have to decide, I don't want to go to church. Well, my wife and I made the decision, well, we're all going to church because that's what we do as a family. And they went and, they grumbled a bit sometimes, but they're all walking with Jesus now. But yeah, look, a point will come, particularly as your kids get older and come of age, where sometimes you just have to let them go. But you're not letting them go. You're letting them go into God's hands. But you can't control and manipulate their life further because they have to make their choice. You can't make their choice for them. Now, you can feed the right stuff in as they grow up and put everything their way, so you hope and pray they will make the right choice. And if the point comes where they just seem to reject that for now, well, my advice is, listen, don't force. You'll only make it worse at that point. Certainly when you're talking 16, 17, 18-year-olds, back off, but do not back off in prayer, because your prayer, praying for your kids, is powerful and can reach them even when they're not expecting it.
This picture language that Jesus is using about walking the easy or hard route through the wide or narrow gate and so on, this isn't a ramble, I'm sure. And in fact, the Message paraphrase of the Bible again says this. It says, "The way to life, to God, is vigorous and requires total attention."
Yeah, well, there's an example of the Message having a sort of great punchy line, but it not really saying what the text says. But its purpose is absolutely true. It is a vigorous life. It's an exciting life. I was 18 when I became a Christian. I have had the adventure of my life. I've been all around the world. I've seen stuff and done stuff I would never have done had I not been a Christian and just grown up in a nice sort of middle-class job somewhere. I've had the adventure of my life. My kids have grown up having the adventure of their life. And it does require vigorous. That doesn't just happen. You have to be someone who, this whole episode is about choosing, making good choices. And, none of what I've done is me. I would want to say, this is God's doing in me. But I had to make the right choices. And there were times in my life when, I could have gone this way or that way, when I could have pursued a career or responded to the call of God to serve him. And so all of us constantly, this is not a one-off. This is not just like when you start following Jesus. There'll be choice after choice after choice that you have to make. And it doesn't come down to the level of, should I have cornflakes or shredded wheat for breakfast? I think God's very happy to leave that one to you. But there are serious choices at times in life where if we're a real follower of Jesus, we're going to be saying, Jesus, what do you want? This is not about what I want. I want to give vigorous attention to pursuing you. It's going to take passion and effort, and at times sacrifice. That picture of the wide gate, the narrow gate. The wide gate, anyone can get through. Bring your suitcases, bring your trolley, bring whatever you've got. Bring the pickup truck with all the garbage in the back of it. Narrow gate, hey, it's like one of those narrow stiles in English pathways. There's times when you just have to choose to leave the rucksack behind. You can't get through with it. So there are choices, vigorous decisions to be made. And if you just drift along, well, do you know what? Hey, you'll drift along with the crowd and you'll get there at the end. But I tell you what, you'll miss out on an exciting adventure with Jesus.
And are you sure there's not a middle route, a middle way through all of this?
Yeah, I'm 100% convinced. Not because of me, but because of Jesus. I mean, this teaching couldn't be clearer. He says there are two ways, two gates, two destinies, two crowds. And you're in the one or the other. You're either on the easy, broad, comfortable way, everything goes, anything goes, but it leads off the edge of a cliff, or you're on the narrow way, walking with me. There are two gates, a wide gate. You don't need to leave anything behind. Bring it all. Or there's a narrow gate, which will involve at times self-denial and leaving stuff behind. These two destinies to consider. destruction. It's real. Hell is real. Or life, eternal life that Jesus spoke about so much in the Gospels, especially John's Gospel. And these two crowds, one of the problems is that the broad road has lots of people on it.
Very popular.
Very popular. Why? Because it's easy going. It makes no demands on you. It says, you can believe whatever you like. Well, as long as you're not too vocal about it, if I don't like it. But there are many people, it's really easy going. There are few. There are often times when Christians find themselves in the minority on issues. So it's not always easy, but Jesus could not be clearer in this parable here. 2 ways, 2 gates, 2 destinies, 2 crowds. Two. I think he wants us to get the message, doesn't he? There's not a third way. There's not a 1 foot in this camp, 1 foot in the other. Do you know the people, in my experience, who have been the most miserable in life are people who call themselves Christians but who still want to live in the world. So they'll be there on Sunday, might even be there at the midweek meeting. But on the rest of the week, they've got a foot in the world. And they're going out with their mates, and they're getting drunk at night, or they're getting involved in all the gossip that's going around in the neighbourhood, or they're sleeping around, or whatever it might be. Oh, but come Sunday, they're back on the other path again. Those are the most miserable people of all, because do you know what? They get the best of neither world. They think they're getting the best of both, but you're getting the best of neither. You're not really sinning properly because you've got this tug on your conscience all the time and you can't go the whole way. And when you're there with God's people, you're not really feeling at home because you know what you've been doing that week. People who try to straddle the 2 ways are, in my experience, the most miserable people of all. And you need to make a choice, is what Jesus is underlining in this parable.
So the majority aren't always right. And even though we're advised to go with the flow, Jesus is saying something very different. And interesting that he starts the parable by saying the word enter through the narrow gate. In other words, don't just stand there and look at the gate. You actually got to do something about it.
Oh, yeah. There's a point of decision. And we don't become a Christian by sort of looking at Jesus from afar. Now, the great thing is, it's just been wonderful in recent years to see so many people coming to things like Alpha courses and coming to church services and looking and seeing and saying, can I take a look at this? And my answer is, you bet you can come and take a look. Look as long as you like. Test it out. Ask your questions. See if it's going to work. But a point has to come when you have to enter, when you have to decide. You don't become a Christian just by hanging around. Do you know, when I first became a Christian, I became a Christian between the period of leaving school and going up to university, that 3-month period. Got involved with a church youth club and then started going to church, well, coerced into going to church. It was the truth of it at the time. But as I heard the gospel more and more over that period, I began to think, I agree with that. I agree with that. I agree with that. And I got to the point where I thought, well, I agree with all of this. Surely I must be a Christian then. But something in my heart said, Mike, commit. And I still remember getting down on my knees by the side of my bed on a particular date and saying to the Lord, right now, at this time on this date, and waiting for the clock hand to get round to midnight and saying, I give my life to you, and I waited for the second hand to get to the top and then said, now. You know, I look back and it looks a bit funny, but I wanted the Lord to know I'd not just drifted, wasn't sort of hovering around. I had made a choice. This is it, Lord. I'm entering by that narrow way and that narrow gate, and I am committing myself to walking this path with you. Never regretted it, never looked back on it.
Bible expert Mike Beaumont explaining the parables of Jesus to David Taverner. Bible Parables in 30 Minutes is just one of a series of podcasts from Mike and David that help to make sense of the Bible. Some of them recorded on location in the Holy Land, and beyond. You can check them all out on the easy-to-use app UCB Player or wherever you listen to your podcasts.